In an investigation, details matter.
Keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there.
So there isn't a crazed killer on the loose wandering the streets.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello, and a warm welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. One of the most obvious criticisms the Ramseys faced was that they were uncooperative, specifically with regard to making themselves available to be formally interviewed. And they were basically not making themselves available to be formally interviewed. And that it's in that sense that they were seen as uncooperative. And secondly, they weren't particularly available because they had a wall of lawyers basically shielding themselves from law enforcement. Patsy had a lawyer, John had a lawyer, Burke had a lawyer, and also Lucinda, John's first wife. Now, you may feel that this is old territory, it's a well-worn path, but the part that I find fascinating is how this was addressed by the Ramseys themselves right in the beginning. In 1998, when they made a documentary, where they participated in the documentary, where they put all the people that supported them, their lawyers, their friends, their relatives, all the apologists in one place. It was a documentary called JonBenet's America. It's really interesting how this narrative basically started off. Is there really any confusion on this question? Because if you take a few obvious questions, did they take a lie detector test? How long did it take to do the lie detector test? Well, you come up with some very interesting answers. I think that happened somewhere around 2000. If the Ramseys were innocent, they could actually have excluded themselves lickety-split by taking a lie detector test right in the beginning. Anyone who is a proponent of the intruder theory has to acknowledge that, rightly or wrongly, the Ramseys weren't exactly camped out at the police headquarters hungry for news on the investigation. In fact, for large swathes of time, they weren't even in Boulder. According to the Denver Post, on February 16th, that's already less than 2 months after this incident, Boulder police are in Atlanta to interview John Ramsey's former wife and other family members and friends in a follow-up to an earlier trip in the investigation of JonBenet Ramsey's murder. Now get this, John Ramsey and his current wife Patsy also fly to Atlanta to support Ramsey's former wife. So you literally have a situation where the police go to Atlanta to speak to John's first wife, and the Ramseys then go there as well to provide her with support. Just think of the irony. The police want to know what is going on with the Ramseys, and they've got to go all the way to Atlanta to speak to his first wife. And then the Ramseys themselves also go there to provide support for that first wife. According to this article, Lucinda Ramsey Johnson was John's first wife, and Pat Corton, the family spokesman, said from Washington that Johnson told Atlanta newspapers last week that she expected Boulder police to ask her questions that could confirm her claims that the two older children from her former marriage with John Ramsey were with her December 26th, when JonBenet died. Andrew Ramsey at that stage was 20 and his sister Melinda was 25. According to the Daily Camera, the Ramseys moved from Boulder in the summer of 1997, returning to Atlanta. Now bear in mind, the police still needed to do a follow-up interview after the one in April, but by then the Ramseys weren't even in Boulder anymore. The grand jury trial hadn't even happened, hadn't even been concluded, and the Ramseys had already moved to Atlanta. Now, in JonBenet's America, an apologia featuring all the arch Ramsey apologists during the period of the grand jury trial, one of the many myths that I feel are perpetuated in this documentary is this idea that the Ramseys cooperated with the police. I think it's quite simple. The police wanted to talk to the Ramseys immediately, formally and separately, and the Ramseys didn't want to talk to them, certainly not then. Instead, they appeared together on CNN, and that was essentially their statement. For the police, they set conditions, they delayed talking to the police for 4 long critical months, and they wanted copies of what they had told the police previously. What I want you to listen to is Brian Morgan, the Ramsey attorney, speaking in this documentary in 1998, his response to these claims of cooperation. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. This is very likely my last episode for 2023. I want to extend a warm thank you, just a big hug to all my loyal subscribers and friends of this channel. Thank you very much for your support, your kindness, your encouragement right through this year. Much appreciated. Also hope you have a safe, happy, resilient, and wonderful 2024. Part of that process is what you decide you're going to do in 2024. Don't just hope for the year to deliver. You've also got to take some action yourself. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started.
2 weeks since their daughter was murdered, and in those 2 weeks, we've seen only one highly orchestrated appearance by them hugging a bishop on the steps of a church. When will you decide that enough is enough?
Once more, the reality was rather different.
The Ramseys were interviewed on the 26th. The Ramseys were interviewed on the 27th. On the 27th, they gave samples of physical evidence, blood, hair, fingerprints. When they returned from Atlanta, the Ramseys gave 5 handwriting samples voluntarily in the case of Patsy, 2 in the case of John. That the Ramseys have not cooperated in this investigation is a gross mischaracterization.
Now, what's very misleading with that particular clip is you, first of all, have someone making comments about the first 2 weeks, journalists talking about the first 2 weeks, and then you have this lawyer who I presume was interviewed in 1998. So in other words, he knew about what followed that period, right? And so how on earth can you say from 1997, January 1997, to whenever this documentary was made, presumably mid-1998, that the Ramseys had cooperated when it had taken basically a year and a half to get 2 interviews with each parent. A year and a half to get 2 interviews. And it was only after those interviews that the grand jury investigation and kind of hearing could take place, thanks to this long delay from the parents. It should have been underway. The grand jury trial should have been underway in the first 6 months, not the last 18 months. And in the end, the verdict in that grand jury trial came about in 1999, 3 years later. So it's simply in terms of the timeline, are you really going to say that there was so much cooperation that you ended up with a non-result in 1999? And I think another way of looking at this is how cooperative in terms of the legal aspect was the Boulder district attorney in letting people know what was really happening, in, let's call it, cooperating with the idea of bringing a case to trial, that you ostensibly are bringing a case to trial. For me, one of the most astonishing things about JonBenet's America, this documentary that came out in 1998, kind of as a, I think, kind of PR for, for this period when the grand jury is taking place, is the complete and utter denial of any kind of sexual activity, right? There's extensive rebuttal and counter-arguments that there was no sexual activity whatsoever in this crime perpetrated against JonBenet. And then once the Ramseys were found apparently not guilty, once that hurdle was passed, right? Once there was this appearance, this suggestion that the grand jury weren't able to do anything, weren't able to come to any kind of conclusion, as soon as that was passed, then suddenly the crime against JonBenet was elevated to an exclusively sexual crime by a sexual predator. Do you see that? And it's really by following the timeline that kind of mismatch really stands out. It's strange how people forget this aspect because it's a super significant change in their own narrative. Also, in terms of JonBenet's America, it is staggering just how aggressive Brian Morgan, the Ramsey attorney, is on camera, nodding his head to emphasize how the Ramseys gave this, gave that. I'm going to play that again. I've played it earlier. I'm going to play it a second time. Just listen to the inflection in his voice about how he feels regarding this question of cooperation.
One highly orchestrated appearance by them hugging a bishop on the steps of a church. When will you decide that enough is enough?
Once more, the reality was rather different.
The Ramseys were interviewed on the 26th. The Ramseys were interviewed on the 27th. On the 27th, they gave samples of physical evidence, blood, hair, fingerprints. When they returned from Atlanta, the Ramseys gave 5 handwriting samples voluntarily in the case of Patsy, 2 in the case of John.
2 in the case of John. Just the aggression in which he says that is extraordinary. And in terms of this question of cooperation, if you think about, oh wow, Patsy had to give so many handwriting samples, were they badgering her? Well, it turned out, like many months down the line, that Patsy was actually ambidextrous. And that's kind of an example of cooperation. Do you want to put up your hand and say, by the way, I know you want to check my handwriting. Do you know that I'm ambidextrous? Do you know that I can actually write with my other hand as well? Instead, they had to find that from one of her school teachers. And then only when they checked that sample did they feel that they made any real progress in analyzing Patsy's handwriting. But is that an example of cooperation, where someone's got to go to your school teacher to find out that actually we need to test the left hand as well? The other thing is that he says they were interviewed on the 26th and 27th. He doesn't acknowledge those weren't formal interviews. I don't know if you can say that they were interviewing John and Patsy when Patsy was kind of had her hands over her face, and you kind of had the situation where the police were led to believe they were dealing with a kidnapping and they were waiting for a call. How on earth are you interviewing the parents when you're setting up phone taps and doing all of that sort of thing? The real question to ask is, how long did it take for those 2 formal interviews to actually happen? And how many conditions did the Ramsey lawyers set in order to allow them to happen? And were those conditions really acceptable? In any other case, would you provide someone with the statements that they'd already made? Would you do that with Chris Watts? Would you say, Chris Watts, before you talk to us, this is the statement you made on camera. Here's the transcript. Here's page 1, 2, 3. By the way, would you like to study that for a while? Right? It's just not really how it's done with most other cases. And so you could also say, were the Ramseys getting special treatment? And obviously they were. You've got experts saying what should have happened right in the beginning is they should have been separated, questioned separately, immediately. And that never happened. That didn't happen until it was too late. Now, in the Ramsey's own book, they've got a chapter or an appendix, a Chronicle of Cooperation. They talk about how they were questioned throughout the day on December 26th. That's not really cooperation. That's something that anybody would do in that situation. Then the next bullet point, police interviewed and questioned John and Patsy on December 27th, and John again on December, I think it's 28th. And of course, Patsy was unavailable. Patsy was medicated, and so she was unavailable to be questioned. That's not quite cooperation. They also note that the police were with them 24 hours a day from 6 a.m. December 26th through to about 2 p.m. Sunday. Well, what do you expect? They've framed this as a kidnapping, and so you'd think that the police need to be there to protect them. But the flip side of that is the police aren't there questioning them. The Ramseys are saying, essentially, we're too overwrought. Basically when JonBenet was found, that was the moment to basically take the Ramseys straight from there to the police station and commence questioning. If you say, well, that would be insensitive, their child had just died, well, the flip side is it's kind of insensitive to go to CNN, talk to them one day after JonBenet's funeral, and then it's another 3 months before they have this formal interview with law enforcement. I've just personally found this documentary, JonBenet's America, which, as I say, is full of apologists, fascinating in terms of how this narrative was carved in stone, and arguably it was a successful narrative given where we are today. So if you'd like me to continue looking at it, let me know in the comments. Again, thank you for your support this year. I wish you a wonderful new year and a safe 2024, and I'll see you guys next time.